I'm learning history in Cleveland, Tennessee. Ocoee Society.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Curious Curators. I'm Hope.
And I'm Lindsay.
And today we're actually going to go a little bit further back in history than we have so far, I think. And we're going to talk about some Roman emperors. Because, I mean, everybody knows a little bit about Roman emperors, but they're a bit much.
That is true. That is true.
I strive for the amount of extraness that most Roman emperors had. So.
There's a reason that there are plays made about Roman emperors because drama.
Just some of the quotes that we have today.
We have some great quotes.
Just so much. And I plan to integrate those quotes into my everyday life, starting when I started with this research, actually. So I think I've learned a little bit.
Yeah. So I think when we got started on this research, one of the suggestions we talked about, because we outlined before we do this, and I said, we need to talk about the start of the Roman Empire, which is what I did, and I wrote a paragraph. Hope decided to go completely back in time to the very foundations of Rome, through the Roman, I think, monarchy, then the Republic, then the Empire. I just wrote a quick blurb about how the Roman Empire got started, but Hope, if you want to introduce us to the very beginnings of Rome.
Well, I think a lot of people think of Rome just as empire, right? You just think of it as this Roman Empire, but that's not the case. No. All right, so Rome was founded on the banks of the Tiber River. And there's this whole long creation myth that the mother of Romulus and Remus, who would go on to be the city's founders, she was a Vestal virgin, which you might remember from us talking about last time. But she got pregnant by the god Ares, and they did not wall her up in a room. This was quite early. I guess the walling you underground was later. But they were going to throw the children into the Tiber, but a servant took pity.
For those that did not listen to our last podcast, if a Vestal virgin breaks her vows
of celibacy,
she's basically put in a cave and walled in.
Yeah, and buried alive, basically. But that must have been like a later Rome thing. I couldn't really find a lot on that. I also didn't get too crazy about it. Anyway, so they floated down the Tiber a bit because the servant took pity on them, and a she-wolf found them and nursed them, which is a very famous statue, in a cave called the Lupercal, which would be like the wolf's cave. Yeah. And a shepherd came along, found them, adopted them, and they didn't know their true identities until later, and there's this whole long myth, but basically what happened was the two of them ended up meeting their grandfather, who was the king of a city called Alba Longa, about 12 miles away, put him back on the throne, and then they were like, we're going to make our own city. So if you know much about Rome, it's built on 7 hills. So Romulus wanted to build on the Palpatine Hill. Remus wanted to build on one called the Aventine Hill. They had a contest of augury, which is when you see signs from birds.
Okay.
And Remus saw 6, Romulus saw 12, and that meant he won, but there was kind of an ensuing argument, and general consensus is that Romulus killed his brother and built the city of Rome on Palpatine Hill. So that's the myth of creation. There were 7 kings. He was the first, followed by 6 more, and that was a period of about 243 years, and then we moved into the Republic, which ended with, the first Roman emperor being Augustus, so that ended with the death of Caesar. I managed to shorten that considerably.
Wow. It's actually great. Like I said, I had a paragraph and you had several pages.
I managed to shorten it considerably.
Yeah, so it kind of came about after the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, I think, started from the 6th century BCE through the 1st century BCE. And Julius Caesar was declared perpetual dictator.
Dictator for life.
Yeah, of Rome. And there was about 10 years of chaos and civil war after his death until Octavian got in a war against Mark Antony around 31 BCE. And Octavian actually, he won, and he also conquered Ptolemaic Egypt from Hellenistic Greece. and the Senate gave him more power, said,
Right.
you're basically the dictator, you're the emperor, gave him the title Augustus, and that made him the first emperor of Rome.
Yes, and Augustus actually means the illustrious one. Augustus is the first emperor that I looked up because he's my history crush. So I was not going to skip this chance to talk about it.
You have a lot of history
I
crushes,
do.
though, let's be real.
From everything that we've talked about, I probably have a history crush, but Augustus is my Roman emperor history crush. So that's where we're going to start. He actually did not call himself like an emperor or anything else, so he called himself first citizen.
Oh, I
So-
like that. It's very dystopian.
Yes, he didn't want to be, he didn't want to seem like, I guess he was better than everyone else, but he was kind of in charge of everything, so there's that. But, seems like a relatively nice guy in doing that. And actually, most of his support came from the plebeian classes. That's where he was born into that class. I think his family worked with horses, so they were quite wealthy anyway, but he was kind of adopted by Caesar and made his heir, which is interesting since the whole Civil War broke out, and you would think, he already did this, but it's whatever. And he was kind of one of those, I said he was kind of a nice guy, but while he was at war with Mark Antony, and I just thought this was, interesting, important men would keep their wills in the Temple of the Vestals.
Okay.
Here we go again. So he broke in and stole Mark Antony's will and, had it published in a smear campaign.
Politics hasn't changed.
Not at all. And basically this will said that Antony was going to give land taken by Rome to his children to rule, so kind of dividing the empire back up a little bit, and also that he wanted Alexandria to be the final resting place for himself and his queen, Cleopatra.
Well, yeah.
Cleopatra was his queen. We left that part out a second ago, but general knowledge we were thinking, I think. But yeah, Augustus kind of started a time known as the Pax Romana, which is a Roman peace. It lasted about 2 centuries, which is interesting because all of the triumphal arches, they're going off to war. But I guess they weren't in a large-scale war at the time, so about 2 centuries of not large-scale war. But poor Augustus was kind of an unlucky guy. He had 3 heirs that all died. Quite young as well. He had Marcellus, a nephew, who died at age 21. And then he had 2 adopted sons, Gaius and Lucius, who died at 19 and 23. And that's kind of how Tiberius ended up becoming his heir, because everyone else died. But Augustus was super popular to the people, and almost every year they would riot in the streets if they thought the Senate was trying to take his power away. They were going to make sure that he stayed, in charge.
Okay.
Which I kind of thought was interesting because, Caesar wasn't quite that popular, but it's whatever. And he was married 3 times. I think that's pretty common. They were all married quite a bit.
Yeah.
And divorce was actually way more common than everyone thought. So he was married to Claudia, the stepdaughter of Antony, who he clearly divorced because that was a power play. Then he was married to a woman called Scribona, and they actually had his only child together, Julia. But they divorced. Would you like to know his exact words? This is the first of the
I
quotes.
would love to hear this quote.
He was unable to put up with her shrewish disposition. Nice guy. And
Me
then-
as a wife.
Same. Then he married Livia, who he was married to until his death. He died at the same place that his father died, a place called Nola. And Livia's kind of been implicated throughout history. Now, I don't know what, actual Roman sources would say about this. I don't read Latin or anything else. And I'm not sure, because, things changed so much from most of their biographers were writing much later. But there's a story that Livia was kind of a poisoner anyway. Apparently, she killed all of his heirs to ensure that Tiberius would be the one. But then there's this story of Livia giving him a poisoned fig, and they're not sure if that was murder or if it was assisted suicide. But Livia kind of killed him. But one of my favorite things about Augustus, at this point, besides his statues, are his last words.
All right, I'm ready for this.
So he had public last words and private last words. So his
Okay.
public last words were, "Behold, I found a realm of clay," some sources say wood, "and leave her to you of marble."
Oh, wow.
That's nice. That's his last public words. But his last, like, private words were my favorite. They were, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." And I'm like, yes.
This is why they make great plays,
I know.
drama.
I know, he's great. And he was the first of a dynasty, right? And
Yes.
I think we both have a little bit more on that dynasty. So would you like to pop in there with the next one?
Yeah, so we're not talking about every single Roman emperor.
We never could.
Yeah. So we're kind of talking about the ones that we personally find the most interesting. Definitely, I think from now on, I think Augustus was the most sane. The
He was.
best of the ones that we're talking about today, because I'm talking about Caligula. His real name as an emperor was Gaius Germanicus. Caligula was a reference to the little boots he wore as a child. So he ruled from 37 to 41 CE. And he was basically, he was the son of a Roman general, and his mother, I think, was the granddaughter of Augustus,
Okay.
or she was related to Tiberius,
Okay.
who followed Augustus. And he basically had a really rough childhood. His father was murdered, supposedly poisoned by Tiberius, who was worried about his growing popularity. His two older brothers also died. I believe one brother was imprisoned, and the other brother died. His family, his mother, him, and his sisters were exiled to a barren rock, I believe, and his mother starved to death. And this was all done by Tiberius, who was scared of them coming to power over him, or there being some kind of coup or something like that. So he was actually summoned at age 17 to the island of Capri, where Tiberius had set up his imperial court. And he went expecting the worst, but it turns out that Tiberius needed an heir. So he took Caligula under his wing, and there are a lot of stories about what went on here. And it could be propaganda, because in Rome, sexual promiscuity and deviance went hand in hand with being a bad ruler. So they would create smear campaigns talking about sexual deviance and promiscuity in order to smear someone. But apparently at Capri, there was pornography on the walls, and Tiberius would watch encounters between boys and girls. It did not specify how old they were, but it did call them boys and girls. And anyone who displeased Tiberius was thrown off a 1,000-foot cliff. So Caligula really had to go along to get along.
Right.
But Caligula was a pretty smart kid. He befriended the Praetorian Guard, which we find is a very common thread. The Praetorian Guard assassinating emperors. That's a very common thread. So
They're basically their bodyguards, right?
yeah, they're the Secret Service, essentially. They're Secret Service / Navy SEALs, the Praetorian Guard is. So he befriended the leader of the Praetorian Guard, Macro, so that he would have the support of the Praetorian Guard, which he did. Once Tiberius died, he seized the throne. And Tiberius was very old, so it was likely of natural causes, I'm not sure. And he was eventually voted in as emperor, and he started making all these reforms to get people to like him. He doubled the salary of the Praetorian Guard. He burned the documents of treason trials that his great-uncle Tiberius had done. So his great-uncle Tiberius had gotten really paranoid and was running all these treason trials against the Senate and all these upper-class people, trying to root out all the people who were basically a threat to him, just like he'd done to Caligula's father. So Caligula publicly burned all the files and documents regarding these treason trials to get the Senate on his side. And then he kind of gave a stimulus package to the Roman citizens, but he did it by pelting them with coins off of a 60-foot precipice, essentially.
Whatever works.
Yeah, and so there was a mob, and people were getting pelted with coins, and definitely a showman. And he adopted Tiberius's grandson, Gemellus, who was 14 years old, as his heir, to show that he had good faith to Tiberius's line and all of that.
Seems like a nice guy so far.
In
really.
the first 6 months of his reign, absolutely, he was a great guy. Everybody loved him. He was called Rome's Great Hope. Tiberius had raised taxes. He'd cut public games. He'd conducted these treason and conspiracy trials, and here was Caligula reversing all of these bad things that his uncle had done. He brought public games back, but he fell ill about 6 months into his reign. And everyone kind of prepared for the worst. So Macro, head of the Praetorian Guard, started grooming Gemellus, the one he had taken as his heir, to take the throne. Preparing the kid to become the next emperor. And a lot of people put a lot of weight into this illness. They say whatever this illness was, it knocked a screw loose in his head because of the way he acted after. But there's also the possibility that it was just, he was already paranoid considering his childhood, and then finding out how easily he could be replaced.
By his so-called friends?
Yeah. And everybody started expecting him to not recover, but he recovered. And so he imprisoned Gemellus, and Gemellus, the 14-year-old, was forced to kill himself because the Praetorian Guard is not allowed to spill the blood of anyone in those lines, essentially.
There's a lot of rules about who can kill who.
Yeah, and because Macro was part of the Praetorian Guard, he had a lot of safeguards. So Caligula, as revenge, decided to promote him. And in so doing, he promoted him to prefect of Egypt. But now he's allowed to force him to commit suicide. When he was head of the Praetorian Guard, you couldn't do that. But when he was promoted to prefect, you could do that.
That's actually relatively crafty.
Yeah, so he promoted him, forced him to commit suicide. And during Caligula's sickness, a nobleman said that he would give his life for Caligula to recover. So when Caligula did, he said, "You said you would." So he was forced to kill himself. So now all of a sudden there's a lot of death coming in after Caligula recovers. First, he gets rid of the people he perceives to be his biggest threat, the people who he felt betrayed him. And then, of course, I think that there was some logic behind. This guy said he'd give his life for Caligula to recover. People were very religious.
Yeah, and they believed in things like this. So he needed to.
Yeah.
Because if he didn't, Caligula would probably get sick again.
Yeah, absolutely. But Caligula had a lot of other problems as well.
Poor guy.
He started throwing these very lavish feasts. One of his feasts cost 10 million sesterces, and I could be pronouncing that wrong, but it's actually the annual income of 3 Roman provinces for one feast.
Oh my gosh.
He had exotic foods, I think like ostrich tongue and all kinds of things. He also was apparently sleeping with his younger sister Drusilla.
Aren't they all?
Yeah, and she was married to his close friend. And he basically would caress her in front of her husband and kind of tease her husband in that way. And Caligula was a lover of Eastern culture, so there's been this idea that maybe he was sleeping with her because he wanted to create a Ptolemaic type line. Because the Egyptians, pharaohs, and the Ptolemies, when they took over, it was brother and sister, brother and sister,
right.
brother and sister. He also loved gladiator fights. And gladiators were usually enemy soldiers captured in battle, and he would change the rules so that there would be more blood and they would be more exciting, such as one participant gets armor and the other one doesn't. One participant gets a sword, the other doesn't. He would also import exotic animals to be slaughtered in the arena. Prisoners were sometimes used as food for these animals, and someone booed him, and he had his tongue cut out and thrown into the arena. And Caligula also loved horse and chariot races. Those were his favorite things.
Oh, winner.
And that was one of his most famous stories, kind of came out of this love of horses. His favorite horse was Incitatus. And he gave Incitatus the awards and honors, and told the senators he planned to make him the consul, which is the head of the Senate. And a lot of people think this means he was insane. But to be honest, it could have also been, that's how the story is told. He's told through a number of people who hated him.
Right.
We don't have contemporary accounts. We have people who were telling about it later who hated him.
And I think that's the issue with a lot of these.
Yes.
You get it 500 years later and it doesn't translate the same way.
Yeah, I think the person who wrote a lot of this was doing it about 80 years after his death. But it could have been that he was saying that the senators were so incompetent that a horse could have been the consul.
Right.
Or they were so useless that a horse could be consul.
Yeah, he could do just as well.
Yeah, it's not that he's insane. But he actually brought back out the treason files because apparently he'd only burned copies, but he'd kept all those treason files he'd burned at the beginning of his reign and started running treason trials again against senators.
In all fairness, who would think that he would actually burn the originals?
Right, right. Well, he also was a narcissist. He definitely was a narcissist. He would hijack theater performances to perform all the parts himself. At one point he summoned all the higher senators to him, and they thought he was going to consult them about war against the Gauls. And he basically danced for them and demanded their applause. Because he loves to humiliate the senators and show them how useless they are, how much power he has over them, and he would continue to degrade them throughout his reign. And he would also have them arrested and tortured. At one point, he did arrest and torture high-level senators and uncovered a plot to assassinate him that included his two sisters and Drusilla's husband. Drusilla died. And her husband, Lepidus, apparently got in cahoots with Caligula's other two sisters, Agrippina and another sister. And Agrippina we'll learn about in a minute, I believe, because she was the mother of Nero.
Yeah.
And the sisters were exiled. Lepidus was executed. But there are some other things that Caligula is famous for, and a lot of them were basically to humiliate and degrade the people who insulted him. There's the story where he went to invade England, and he forced the soldiers to collect seashells. But the thing is, they refused to cross. They would not cross. They thought that was the end of the world. They refused to make the crossing of the English Channel, and as punishment, he made them pick up seashells instead of decimating them, which was killing 1 in every 10 men, because that would have really harmed his forces. And at another point, he wanted to come back from that with a triumph, which was a procession through Rome, basically congratulating him for his triumph, for his war efforts. And the Senate refused him this. So instead, he had a whole bunch of boats made across a bay, in a vacation area where senators would go on vacation in their summer homes. And so he crossed it with his soldiers, all of these boats lined up, and created this huge procession on this bridge so that they saw him. He made his own procession.
I enjoy the petty right there. I really do.
He wasn't crazy. He was petty and he was narcissistic.
Which I think, what more can you expect from them at this point?
Yeah. And And then he had a wild party, and then they did the procession back the next day. And of course, all the senators heard the wild party and the debauchery and everything going on.
That they weren't invited to.
That they weren't invited to. And there was, so he did eventually get assassinated, obviously, less than 4 years into his reign, which is very common here. And it was led by a member of the Praetorian Guard. This guy was Charia. I hope I said that right, Charia. And basically Caligula bullied him all the time. Apparently he bullied him about his effeminate voice and his stature and gave him really degrading call signs that mean all kinds of vulgar things or related to being effeminate, things like that. So he headed up an assassination plot when Caligula was addressing an acting troupe in a tunnel under I believe it might have been the Senate or the palace, or they basically snuck up on him, and just like Caesar's death, a whole bunch of them stabbed him. And so they all came together, they attacked him, everybody stabbed him. The Praetorian Guard, who was still loyal to him, did chase down these perpetrators, but they started killing the remainder of Caligula's family.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it was his uncle survived and became the next emperor. But his uncle was hiding behind, I think, a curtain. And
Same.
Yeah, and the loyal Praetorian Guard found him, and he became the next emperor. But Agrippina was, I think, exiled. I think Nero was around somewhere, and I think that's our next one.
Oh, Nero. So I think it's always interesting, Paul. You can maybe say Caligula was just a product of everything that had happened to him. Like, Nero was kind of, to put it kindly, like a wreck.
Okay.
I will say, if you feel like looking up these glorious emperors, if you just look up facial reconstruction, quite a few of them have been reconstructed. And when I saw Nero, I went into Lindsay's office and I was like, this has to be a troll.
She was extremely upset.
I was very upset. The neck beard, which is in his statues as well, but it was just so much worse.
Can you imagine your neck beard being immortalized for eternity?
No. But it was, oh my gosh, it was so bad. The reconstruction of him looked just like Quasimodo.
If Quasimodo had a neck beard.
Yes, well, yeah, he was kind of clean shaven, wasn't he? But it looked, honestly, if Quasimodo was like in, not in cartoon, I can't think of the word. Like, if he was a real person, that's what he would have looked like, Nero. Sorry, it's a day already. But okay, so Nero was the last of the Judeo-Claudian emperors, and his reign was a little bit longer. He reigned for 13 years and 8 months.
Wow, that's longevity for a Roman emperor.
It really is. Which, once you hear about him, you might be a little bit confused about why he lasted that long.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely confused.
But yeah, so he was kind of, long-lasting, if you call 13 years long-lasting, which...
I do. Both of the ones I did research on lasted 4 years or less.
Yeah, so really, him and Augustus were just living large. They
Tiberius ruled a long time, too.
Oh, yeah,
he died, I think, in his 70s.
He was,
But people hated him.
It's really sad. He was kind of the start of the crazy, and it just never ended.
That's true.
After him. If only Livia had poisoned him instead. History could have been changed. But Nero was, pretty smart kid. He studied poetry and music and painting and sculpture. And he played, I'm going to go ahead and mention this because it'll be important later. He played an instrument called a cithara, maybe, which is an early version of a lyre, which could be considered an early version of a fiddle. So just keep that music history in mind. And he loved music, and he actually, loved sports as well. He would go on to perform in the Olympics one year, and he entered quite a few contests, and he won all of them.
Wow!
Even the chariot race that he didn't finish because he was thrown from the carriage, if he would have been able to finish, they thought he would have won. So
well, that makes sense, definitely.
So he won everything he did.
He must have been so talented.
So talented. Such a great athlete and performer, great guy. his name was later scrubbed from the winners list, so you will not find Nero as a winner today. And, his reign started out okay, I guess. His mom was kind of heavy-handed with him, it seemed like.
Well,
but he killed her 5 years into his reign, so.
Well, I mean, he kind of grew up under Caligula, let them hate me so long as they fear me.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Agrippina was his sister, who he possibly was sleeping with as well.
Yeah, and also who orchestrated, like, a death plot for her brother.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah.
He had the cards stacked against him, let's be real.
Yeah, he really did. And they weren't, clearly this family has a couple of issues.
Yeah.
Just a couple. Otherwise, upstanding, great people. So he ended up marrying a woman called Octavia. And throughout their relatively short relationship, he tried to strangle her multiple times. This is after he's already killed his mother. She was kind of...
Didn't he try to kill his mother in multiple ways, but she just kept
coming
them?
back, yeah. That's yeah, it was,
That woman had Horcruxes, I'm sure.
Or he was just a really incompetent man.
Yeah, I saw a reconstruction where he had created this complicated pulley system because she was on her boat and there was a heavy overhang. Yeah. There was an overhang, but they filled it with lead or something.
And they ended up killing, like, her servant instead of her and she could swim. And, like, they were just, he was the most stressful of men.
The overhang was supposed to fall on her, but because the chairs that they lay on have the two lips on the side.
Yeah.
And
there was, like, a little
fell
pocket.
And, like, hurt her ankle.
Yeah, there was, like, a little pocket that she was safe under. Like,
didn't she... I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting.
No, I didn't write down a ton of stuff about her.
I think Agrippina is so interesting because when they finally sent somebody to just kill her, because I think they tried to poison her as well, and she survived that attempt.
And there was something else, like, dumb that he did, like, that she also survived.
Yeah, but what finally worked was he sent people to kill her, and she kind of faced them down, and she said, stab me in the womb where my murderer came from, or something to that effect. She was very dramatic about it.
So dramatic. And, like, they're honestly, like, I don't know if Agrippina really, like, had a will to live, or if Nero was just
that
the most incompetent person to ever try to
assassinate someone.
Yeah, orchestrate a murder plot for somebody that it's not really going to be that hard to kill when you're the Roman emperor.
I feel like it's a whole Monty Python skit, is his attempts to kill his mother.
His literal life. I think his literal life was like a Monty Python. So his mom did.
Yes.
Octavia. Well, he's actually a little bit tired of Octavia, so he exiles her for a little while, and he meets Poppaea Sabina. Wow. So she's already married at this point, but she still becomes his mistress, so it's, fine for him. Literal neckbeard man. But
he's the emperor, though.
I guess you couldn't really be like, no, I won't be your mistress, or no, I won't marry you.
Being the emperor, I guess, makes the neckbeard forgivable.
Or maybe that was the style back then. We're a little bit stuck on the neckbeard, but if you
I've never seen a Roman statue with a neckbeard except him.
I'm gonna link that article in this YouTube video description because you can't not see it. So anyway, Octavia is, languishing in exile, and she ends up killing herself in a suicide ritual. Which usually
did she do it of her own free will?
I'm pretty sure that if you kill yourself in a suicide ritual, it's forced. Or else it wouldn't be a ritual, it would just be like drinking hemlock and being done with the day. So that's not even the best or worst, depending on how you're looking at Nero at this point. So they cut off her head and he had it sent to his mistress. So then, of course, she married him because what else he gonna do?
I really hope he put like a wedding ring in his wife's mouth for his girlfriend.
Pierce their tongue with it or something.
I know they didn't use wedding rings back then, but that would have been...
In a movie of that, they would have, probably. Or like tied it in her hair or something. We are super morbid today.
We're talking about Roman emperors. There's no other way to be.
That's also true. Both of the things we're going to do today are like that.
I just want to point out that you kept saying last podcast that next time we're not going to talk about something so dark.
No.
Just want to point that out.
And it's so dark. So poor Poppaea she had a child with Nero, which is fantastic for her, I'm sure. And then she got pregnant again, and she died. And some sources say that he kicked her in the stomach very hard or over and over, and she died. And then there's some people that say that she was poisoned, but then like nicer sources say that actually there were a lot of complications with the second childbirth and she died from those complications. But from what we know of Nero, he probably killed her. And he got married again. His third wife was called Statalia Messalina. She survived.
Oh, wow. This is starting to turn like
Yeah.
Henry VIII.
But there was some other things that were going on in the background of Nero's marriages. So he saw like a young boy called Sporus, and Sporus looked just like Poppaea Sabina, apparently. So he had him castrated and he married him. And that was his other wife. And then there was a man, he was like a freedman, so that means he was before he was a slave. He was called Pythagoras, and he was actually married to Nero as Nero's husband.
Okay.
And then Sporus was his wife, and then his other wife was also his wife. So nice and confusing. I will say for Nero, just to give him a little bit of something, he became emperor very young. He was 16 years old. And I know that we will later see someone who is even younger. Yeah. And I have to wonder if having that much power at your hands at such a young age, because we see that repeating itself in history with like Marie Antoinette, just doesn't work out. Clearly they have advisors and stuff, but sometimes it just seems like...
When you're the emperor, you don't have to listen, though.
True. Well, apparently he always had his advisors help him make decisions. He was not a decision maker, and they said throughout his life, if he was told to make a decision by himself, it was just panic. He just completely panicked. He could not make decisions alone. And he did like kind of try to do things like lower taxes and stuff like that, and his advisors were like, it was well-intentioned, but it was completely pointless. Like, he was completely incompetent in all of these things. So I don't think anyone ever really had any faith in him. But throughout all of this, he was also haunted by the ghost of his mother and wives that he had murdered.
Okay.
So there's a lot going on. And in 64 AD, when I think the most famous part of Nero's reign comes into play, there was really a lot going on. In 64 AD, Rome caught on fire. And the fire started on the Aventine Hill, which is where Remus had wanted to build Rome, overlooking the Circus Maximus. So I'm sure if you were standing there, it would be absolutely lovely until it caught on fire. And there's a lot of different theories about how the fires start. You know, an ember is carried, someone intentionally starts it. And one of
I think Remus did it.
Yeah, probably. He was mad. Like, fair enough. A lot of people say that Nero burned Rome because he wanted to build this big giant golden palace complex. So they say he just decided to destroy Rome. There's also, I think the most famous of the Nero rumors is that he played the fiddle while Rome burned around him.
I've heard that one.
And as we saw before, I looked this up because I was very curious. The fiddle was not made until so long after he was dead, but maybe he played the cithara.
Yeah.
So he did do kind of nice things. He went ahead and opened all of his palace complexes up to the people of Rome after the fire, and he had food delivered to them, and they started rebuilding. There was plenty of room for his new palace now, because 3 of Rome's districts were completely destroyed and another 7 were severely damaged. There were 14 total, so 4 of them survived perfectly.
You know what I heard speculation on him playing the cithara while Rome burned is that he was an artist.
Yeah.
And that was his way of expressing his sadness towards what was happening and his helplessness.
Maybe.
That's just a theory.
No, to
show that he wasn't a callous figure trying to, thinking, oh, this is great, I get my own palace. It was I'm extremely sad and this is how I express myself.
Well, and I think that we can honestly say that some people do those misguided artistic things even today.
Absolutely, yes.
And you're like, why did you do that? And they're like, well, I didn't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, I feel you. But, he kind of continued on a little bit. There were some conspiracies against him in 65 AD that he managed to thwart. Yes.
Wow.
And then in 68 AD, everything would kind of come to a head and end. So there was a rebellion. And this man called Servius Sulpicius Galba was declared emperor. So Nero was like, right, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to go east because they were still loyal to him in the east. I'm not sure why.
Okay.
But they were. So they kind of declared him a public enemy. The Senate used to declare emperors public enemies basically when they were going to kill them. And I guess other people as well. But Nero started having issues. The soldiers that he was trying to get to help him would not listen to him. No one wanted to do anything that he said. And one of the soldiers apparently quoted Virgil to him and said, "Is it so dreadful a thing then to die?" So I told you they're so dramatic. That's just the regular soldier that said that to him.
Yeah.
It's like, gosh. So he went back home to the palace, had a nap, woke up and realized that everyone was gone. So he started trying to call people to him, like the nobles, his soldiers, no one's coming. And apparently, I'm not sure how they know this, that there was no one around, but he yelled, "Have I neither friend nor foe?" And I guess I would say no one answered him because there was no one there.
So true, had neither.
Yeah, neither. But apparently he did have a couple of friends because one of them lent him a villa about 4 miles away. So he went, and there were about 4 men still loyal to him. And he was like, "Can you just dig me a grave right quick?" So they did. And then this courier arrived. So apparently this place wasn't very secret because someone found him very quickly. So a courier arrived, and he was like, "Look, you've been made a public enemy, and they're going to kill you, and they're going to beat you to death inside the forum, and they're coming to get you now." And he was like, "What?" But in all actuality, with him being the last of this line, this like very famous line that's lasted for most of these senators' lives, they would have found a way to spare him. They had not decided on any of those things. They were still debating, and they probably would have found a way to send him out of the empire and let him live, just because of who he was. But he didn't know that. So he was like, "All right, well, I'm going to kill myself then."
This is very Romeo and Juliet.
It is. He's so very extra, but he was really scared and he couldn't kill himself, so he had his private secretary stab him. And another writer came to tell him, like, "No, don't do this," because they haven't done this, and they were trying to save him. And apparently he said, "What an artist dies in me," when he was being stabbed and bleeding out. And his last words were, "Too late. This is fidelity." And I'm like, "You're too much, sir." But anyway, Galba ended up coming to Rome and becoming the next emperor, and that would lead to the Year of 4 Emperors, which was just absolute chaos. And they were just all trying to overthrow one another. But yes, Nero died. Quite dramatically.
Quite dramatically.
I would say.
So my next emperor comes from the Severan line, from 218 to 222.
Very long reign, him.
Yeah, 4 years. 4 whole years. This was Elagabalus.
I love his name.
And so just something I want to mention here is historians of his time, such as Cassius Dio and Herodian, emphasize his background as a Syrian. He was born in Syria, but his mother was a Roman his parents were Roman citizens.
Okay.
But they basically categorize him as a foreigner and make him out to be all these stereotypes Romans had about Syrians. And the stereotype was that they were effeminate, subservient, perverted, superstitious, and overly attached to luxury. So these historians had these racial biases against Syrians.
Okay.
And he was considered a Syrian. And he was often contrasted with his successor, Alexander, who was truly manly and embedded the Greco-Roman ideals of manliness.
Yeah.
Philosophy was very manly. Wrestling and other manly exercises, but they didn't expound upon what other manly exercises there were.
Chariot racing, possibly.
One of my favorite quotes about Elagabalus by an 18th century historian called Edward Gibbon was, "He abandoned himself to the grossest pleasures with ungoverned fury."
Yes.
I just want to point out, though, he came into his reign when he was 14.
Right, like, what do you expect from him?
So there are all these terrible things mentioned about him, but he came in as a 14-year-old.
How much time did he really have to do terrible things?
Yeah, so he originally, as a child in Syria, he served a god called Elagabal. Elagabalus was not his real name, it was his posthumous name.
Oh, how depressing. I really thought they called him that.
Yeah, his emperor name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. So in 217 CE, Emperor Caracalla, and I probably said that wrong, was assassinated and replaced with a Praetorian guard, essentially. And people revolted against this because a Praetorian Guard should not be
Right. The emperor.
the emperor. So Caracalla's aunt led that revolt to put his cousin, Elagabalus, in as emperor. So he succeeded him in 218. He was 14 years old, and he did not have the same religion as Rome, as the Romans.
He grew up somewhere else.
Yeah, and he worshipped a Syrian god. So one of the things that really he tried to do during his reign is make Elagabal part of the Roman pantheon. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people hated him.
Which is ridiculous because there's literally a god for everything. So, like, what is adding one more really going to do?
Right. So, and his mother and his grandmother really tried to manipulate his way into being a legitimized Roman emperor, that people would accept him. And he actually, 14-year-old boy, he appointed his mother and his grandmother to the Senate. And they were the first women ever appointed to the Senate.
Well, it looks like we stand a king.
Either that or just saying his mother and his grandmother had a lot of influence on him and they said, you're going to appoint us to the Senate. What's a 14-year-old boy going to say?
But still, it happened. So.
It happened. They were the first women. But he started doing weird things. Like he decreased the purity of the silver denarius. Denarius, why? I don't know, but he did. And so it made money worth less. He tried to install Elagabal as the head of the Roman pantheon over Jupiter.
Well, Jupiter is already the head. He's already very busy. Like,
Elagabal was a sun god, so he created a temple called the Elagabalium. Very creative.
What happened to this? Why have we never heard of this?
Because it was torn down. It was built on the Palatine Hill, and Elagabal was represented with like this rock. It was a black meteorite from Syria that they brought over. And he also took all of the most sacred artifacts of the Roman religion and brought them to the Elagabalium. And Elagabalus had himself circumcised to be a priest of Elagabal. And he danced around the altar to drums and cymbals in front of the senators.
I mean, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, he was, as a child, he was a priest to Elagabal. So he was kind of continuing what he did as a child.
Right.
He married 5 times in his 4-year reign.
That was my question. I was like, so if he was a priest, could he get married?
Yes. He married first when he was 15, divorced. Then he married a Vestal Virgin. And he was doing this so that he could, and this was probably his mother's idea, to combine the Roman pantheon, to connect the Roman pantheon with Elagabal.
So this Vestal Virgin would have been literally like double his age, probably.
Well, I mean, they started when they were 6 to 10 years old,
Well,
so
he's
she
15.
could have been. Yeah, it wasn't like she'd been a Vestal Virgin for 30 years. She was still quite young.
So he pulled her out of.
Yes, yeah. He did not
Oh.
marry a former Vestal Virgin. He married a current Vestal Virgin. But they divorced. Then he married
And then he divorced her.
Yeah.
I'm shocked.
Well, he actually remarried her later. Then he married a widow of a Senate member who was executed for treason. She was not.
Oh, I was like, her?
The husband was.
Okay.
Then divorced her. Then he returned to the Vestal Virgin. And then I don't know who the 5th wife was. We don't know. We know he married 5 times, but we don't know the identity of the last wife.
Okay.
But he preferred male lovers, and he had favorites within his court. One of them was the athlete Aurelius Zodicus, who he appointed to a high position. His very favorite was Heracles, who was a charioteer and a former slave. And Elagabalus basically called himself Heracles' wife and tried to have him appointed Caesar.
Okay.
One of his quotes was, "I am delighted to be called the mistress, the wife, the queen of Heracles."
Okay.
He would wear makeup and wigs. This is, and like I said, this is all coming from the perspective of people who hated Syrians
and said that
they were
basically
effeminate and
this
subservient.
Is what they said about them.
Yes. So, of course, and maybe he did all this, maybe he didn't. But he wore makeup and wigs apparently and preferred to be called lady, and offered vast amounts of money for any doctor who could give him sexual reassignment surgery to become a woman. And so a lot of people have called him the first trans person to seek sexual reassignment surgery, the first one that we know of who specifically was transgender. we don't know how true all of this is because of the bias that was coming from. But
If it is true, that's very cool, though.
yeah, it's very interesting. But he apparently married Zodicus at a public ceremony and tweezed all of his body hair, which sounds extremely painful.
Right? I can't do my eyebrows.
I
for
can
5 minutes
barely do
without-
my
I'm like,
eyebrows.
oh my gosh.
And he apparently prostituted himself in brothels and the imperial palace. And I just want to point out, they make it sound so scandalous that he did this in the palace.
There were prostitutes there already.
Yeah. This was not the first time parts of the imperial palace had been turned into a brothel. There has been precedent for this. He set aside a room in the palace and there committed his indecencies, always standing nude at the door of the room as harlots do, and shaking the curtain which hung from gold rings, while in a soft and melting voice he solicited the passers-by.
See, here's my thing. If he's doing all this, he's like so busy. How is he still being emperor?
He was also accused of sacrificing children to a Lagabal and examining their vitals for, like, telling the future and for certain rites under a Lagabal. But once again, I think this might be a perception of this foreign god, trying to make this foreign god seem as evil as possible, that he was sacrificing children. And he is basically accused of doing all these awful things to people who visited him. He had tame lions and leopards, and he would hide them in guest rooms, and then when the guests went in, there was a lion in there.
My actual dream?
Yeah, well, people talk about how horrible he was. He was a 15-year-old kid with tame lions. What else do you expect him to do?
What else are you going to do with them?
And he would... At one point, he threw snakes on people assembled for games. He was accused of strapping guests to a water wheel, which was basically a wheel that dunked them underwater repeatedly. He also may have invented the whoopee cushion.
Oh, okay.
He filled, I think, like a bladder with air and put it on seats so when they sat down, it would fart. He was a 15-year-old person who was in charge of 55 million people.
Right? Like, clearly all that goes to show is in a couple thousand years, things don't change.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a 15-year-old kid, and Rome had a lottery, but the prizes he would give out are bees, dead dogs, and flies, and other things like this, because he was a kid.
Right.
Like, and he had all the power in the world. He was the most powerful person in the world, and he was 16 years old.
Right. Like, I couldn't imagine the trouble I would have gotten into if I was the most powerful person in the world now.
Yeah. So, and he called the senators slaves in togas because they had to obey him.
But that's basically what they were.
Yeah. 16-year-old kid. He's uppity. He's a prankster. He can do whatever he wants. He has all the money. He has all the power.
And no repercussions.
He was eventually murdered. And, he could have been a young man struggling with his sexuality at the time as well.
Right.
So think about this 15, 16-year-old high school kid, dealing with his sexuality, but also being the most powerful person in the world.
Literally the most powerful person in the world.
Yeah. And like I said, a lot of this stuff might not even be true. It might have been propaganda because he was a Syrian. But, if you want to take it at that value, still, I don't think he gets as much lenience as he should because he was 14 when he took on the role.
So young.
And he was just having the time of his life making whoopee cushions.
Right. He was playing with tame lions.
Yeah.
Like,
wouldn't you do the same thing if you were a 15-year-old kid and you had tame lions?
probably. No, I would be like laying in the middle of the tame lions, but that's fine.
Well, okay, yeah.
But it's fine. Like, yes, I understand.
15-year-old boy.
Yeah, well, I've never been a
Tame
15-year-old
lions.
boy, so
Yeah,
I don't
me
know,
either.
but...
So that's Elagabalus.
I actually enjoy Elagabalus.
I think he's very interesting, and it's so interesting with him, though, because he's so forgotten.
Yeah,
Of course, they tried to scrub him from the record, but you can't find documentaries on him.
No, I couldn't find much about him when we were talking about him.
Look up Caligula documentary, you will get thousands of results.
Oh my gosh, they're everywhere. There's even movies about Caligula.
Yeah, but Elagabalus, I couldn't even find stuff on YouTube that were more than 2 minutes long.
They don't really talk about Augustus very much either. I
Yeah.
think because Augustus wasn't completely insane, he was just a guy.
Yeah.
So they're like, eh. I think they focus on the crazy ones. I did want to mention one thing that I had forgotten. So we all know about the Antichrist, at least we do today. And how the number 666 is like the number of the beast, and it is like all related, right? Do you know who people have thought since he died, people have thought was the Antichrist? Nero. people were convinced that Nero was either the Antichrist or he would return as the Antichrist. And apparently, and I don't know anything about numerology, I'll go ahead and put that out there, but apparently the name Nero Julius Caesar, which is Nero's like emperor name, translates to 666 if it's done like in Aramaic and then like changed to Hebrew or something. I'm not 100%.
Seems like a stretch, but okay.
Right, but like Nero is apparently the Antichrist. So if you never knew, look up that picture and
unfortunately,
look into the face of the Antichrist.
If he came back, judging on his reconstruction, he's probably in his mom's basement. Railing on Twitch streams about video games.
Agreed. If anybody has any suggestions on who that might be, let us know. But yeah, I guess we're probably out of time.
And so an artist dies in me.
If you enjoyed this, applaud as we exit.
Applaud as we exit. Thanks, guys.